This is Next Radio 2016 with Broadcast Bionics, innovative solutions for creative people.
So I've flown thousands of miles here today to challenge you. Usually I present about podcasting, I bring a withering torrent of slides, which I've chosen not to bring today. I'm not going to talk about data today, but I am going to talk a little bit about the future. And I've come to challenge you, as I said, in two ways. The first is, unfortunately, for much of this talk, I will be speaking American. The second way is really to challenge how you think about podcasting, what podcasting is, what it isn't, and if you are ready to do what it takes to invest in the space. How many of you have a podcast, just out of curiosity? I think this is the new New Yorker cartoon cocktail party question. What's your podcast? I have a podcast. A lot of us have a podcast. How many of you are making money podcasting? How many of you have monetized your podcast? So this is what has changed a lot in the past 2 years. Podcasting, I've been involved in the space for 12 years as an analyst and as a researcher, and also as a fan of the medium. But it's changed more in the last 2 years than it has ever changed. And really, I could sum up all of that change in just one word, and that's money. Money has happened to podcasting. Money has happened to podcasting in a variety of ways. Money is being invested in the space like it has never been. Money is being extracted from the space in ways that it never has been. In just the past 2 years, I would ballpark the market as going from a $50 million market in the US to about a $150 million market. So it's about tripled in the past couple of years. We've got a lot of clients in the space, so we sort of get a peek under the hood a little bit there. And there's a lot more investment in the space as well. There are people investing in it. There's a lot of talent kind of changing shingles in the space. And so things are changing a great deal. So where is it going? And the question is, do you want to go there with it? And do you want to invest in it? And is it a space that you believe in? And I think before we talk about the future, we should talk a little bit about the past. I'm going to show you something. I hesitated bringing this for two reasons. Number one, it's a symptom of my disease, I think. But number two, how many of you still have one of these old iPods? All right, so I have, this is an iPod Classic that I must admit, spent over twice as much as it originally cost to get a new battery in it, a new hard drive, to pull out the electronics and replace them with better audio. I seriously have spent a lot on this iPod. When podcasting was invented, it was invented to serve this device. This is close your ears, this is a stupid device, right? This device is not online. This device was why podcasting was invented, so we could take quality audio content with us wherever we go. So there was a need for that sort of thing. Today, of course, we have a very different device in our pocket, which kind of obviates the need for a lot of the protocols of podcasting. And certainly one of the things that we have found in our research at Edison over the years is that the dominant paradigm for listening to a podcast has shifted. It has shifted from being a show that you download and then listen to later, and it's become more something that you click and listen to immediately. That doesn't mean streaming necessarily for those who get their pleasure from technical definitions. But it does mean functionally the same thing to a listener, that they're clicking on a piece of content and they're listening to it immediately. So things have changed a great deal, and the notion that we would take a piece of content, download it to our desktop computer, sync it over to this device is kind of quaint, right? But podcasting is never been bigger than it is, and it will continue to get bigger. In the United States, about 1 in 5, or 21% of Americans 12 plus, have listened to a podcast in the last month. Similar numbers over here, similar numbers in Sweden. They're catching up in some other countries. So it's a thing, right? People are doing it. It's worth spending some money on. But it's also getting a lot trickier. One of the things that's really getting a lot trickier about the space is just what I talked about. This kind of changing of the format from a thing that you download and listen to later to something that you could functionally listen to immediately. It's still an on-demand medium, without a doubt. But if you take a show like This American Life, how many of you have ever listened to This American Life? So certainly one of the top 5 podcasts in the world. If you listen to This American Life using the iOS podcast app, you are probably listening to a podcast. If you listen to This American Life on an NPR-affiliated radio station in the United States, you are not listening to a podcast. When you talk about a show like Serial, it gets even more confusing. Serial is only in podcast form, so is it a podcast? Well, yes and no. It's a podcast if you're listening to it through a podcast app and you've downloaded it and so on. You've fulfilled the technical obligations of listening to a podcast. But they also have an agreement with Pandora. And you can go to Pandora and you can listen to Serial. It is then technically not a podcast. It is streamed. It is absolutely the definition of streamed media. But the listener doesn't know that. So the boundaries are shifting a little bit. A podcast is a podcast if you call it a podcast, I guess. But at the heart of it, it's just spoken word content. It's a show. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say, let's change the name, because that train has left the station, or as we say in America, that train has left the station. We're going to keep calling them podcast because that's consumer behavior, right? We're not going to change consumer behavior on that score. A podcast is a podcast. But functionally, that technical definition is starting to become a little bit quaint. The IAB in the United States just released a document that's kind of a technical spec or a measurement guideline for podcasting. And on the one hand, we need that now. A lot of people work really hard on that. It's a very good document. But on the other hand, more and more, as we have this thing in our pocket that calls up the shows we want whenever and wherever we want them, whether it's through streaming or progressive download or whatever, then again, those boundaries start to become a little fuzzy and a little weird. So if you're thinking about investing in the space, the first thing you obviously have to ask yourself is not, can I put on a podcast, but can I put on a show? Do I have the muscles to put on a show and a spoken word entertainment? In the US, there have been loads of people hired away from public media. Public media has had this big brain drain of people being hired away by private entities that are seeking to monetize podcasting. Why is this happening? Because not a lot of people have those muscles. If you look at the top podcasts in the iTunes store, for instance, there's an awful lot of public media podcasts in there. That's for a reason. They have the muscles to do that. They have that muscle memory. They have that spoken word content creation facility in-house. So that's the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do I have that? Or do I not have that? Do I need to get that? Because ultimately, if a podcast is not a special snowflake, as I like to call it, and it's just a show, then you have to put on a great show. I think believing that podcasting is its own kind of special snowflake can be very damaging. If you think of podcasting as if it's a format, what happens to formats? What happens to Blu-ray? What happens to VHS? What happens to mini disc? I have 3 of them at home too. I have a disease. A sad disease. Formats die. The show remains, but formats die. So the first thing you need, again, to ask yourself is, as we go forward into the next 10 years, do you have that muscle memory? Do you have that capability to actually produce an entertainment, a spoken word entertainment? It is very, very difficult. I'm often asked the question by people when I speak at conferences, how long should my podcast be? I love that question. The politically correct answer is as long as it needs to be to say what you need to say, right? Whatever it serves the story. But what I usually tell people, especially after a cocktail, is it should be as long as it needs to be to serve the story, but most people shouldn't go over this because they're not that talented, right? Most people shouldn't go over a half an hour or 20 minutes because you're probably not that good. There's a lot of bad podcasts out there. Folks in this room know how to produce quality audio entertainment, so the world is kind of counting on you somewhat to produce that quality entertainment. So how do we move forward, though? If you're still on the fence about investing more in the space, or wondering, where do I invest that? In what do I put my money? What do I do with all of these pounds of that you just can't wait to throw into podcasting? What do I do with them? What is the future of podcasting? Is it worth it? Well, I have an answer for that, and it's this. Look to your left. Almost nobody did that. I was told when I wore this, I'd be like Tony Robbins. Look to your left. Now look to your right. Okay, you didn't see anybody, but that is the key to podcasting in the next 10 years, is working with and cooperating with the person to your left, the person to your right, the person behind you, and the person in front of you. That is the only way that podcasting is going to grow and is going to flourish is if we don't just work on our podcast, but we work on podcasting. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm here talking about podcasting because it has grown. Sorry, I'm not either. But I think it could have grown more. It could have grown more. There were a couple things I think that held it back. Let me put away my beautifully anachronistic iPod here. A couple things I think have held it back. I did not bring any slides today, but through a series of hand gestures and puppetry, I'm going to illustrate one for you. If you look at how streaming audio has grown in the past 10 years, we have data on this at Edison. Download all you want, we'll make more. It puttered along, and then it sort of took off in a 45-degree angle. And that's kind of the trajectory of streaming audio now. It's leveled off a bit only because younger demos are fairly saturated, and they're still growing in the older demos. But it kind of went up at a 45-degree angle, like that. It mirrors almost exactly, it's a beautiful correlation that warms the cockles of this survey researcher's heart with smartphone ownership. Those two lines both went up at a 45-degree angle. Now, the podcast line did not do this. The podcast line has done kind of that. Brilliant, I don't even need a slide, do I? Right? It's grown linearly and steadily and slowly over the past 10 or 11 years that we've been tracking it. Now, last year, it grew the most that we've ever seen. It grew at a clip of about 24%. Went from 17% of Americans 12 plus listen at least monthly to 21%. So we did get quite a bump there. But it hasn't been this, it's been this. Why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Certainly, one of the biggest is the type of content that it is. What do most people listen to on the radio? Most people listen to music. If you podcast licensed music, a lawyer will shoot you in the face. So there's this natural cap on the kind of content you can play. And that's not going to change. That is really not going to change. You're not going to be able to podcast licensed music without forking over a lot of money. The whole business model for podcasting would have to change quite a bit. So here's something that we know. As I mentioned, about 20% of Americans are regular consumers of podcasts. That 20% echoes another number, completely unrelated, but is worth discussing in this room, and that is this. We have been doing a research series since 2014, a quarterly series called Share of Ear, in which we basically look at how much audio time is going online and offline to all sources of audio. It's a single source measure of all things audio, online and offline. When we started this in 2014, Serial had really not quite popped yet, and the share of ear in terms of total minutes consumed was about 20% spoken word and 80% music. Now today, we've had this great surge in at least awareness and interest in podcasting. We've had Serial, we've had This American Life, we've had TED Talks, we've had all of this wonderful content come out. And today, I'm pleased to announce that the share of ear between spoken word and music it's 20%. It hasn't moved. It hasn't moved for a variety of reasons. It hasn't moved. Number one, part of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is economically more viable for the folks in this room to produce music content, and so we produce a lot of music content. As we produce a lot of music content, a lot of people consume a lot of music content. But of course, as we know, the pure players in the space from people like Spotify and Pandora are changing that economic model. They're reducing the economic value or the scarcity of free music that you like to asymptotically approach zero, as a professor of mine once said. So spoken word is somewhere in all of our future, whether it's talking about music or talking about something else. But that 20%, 80%, there are two levers that we can move here to help podcasting grow. And really only two levers. One is to get more people into the medium. If more people can discover podcasting, then the medium will grow. The one thing that Serial did, by the way, Serial did not grow the space in terms of bodies. Serial became everybody's new favorite podcast who was already listening to podcasts. It did draw some new people, don't get me wrong, but it became those people who were already listening to 3 or 4 podcasts a week, it became their 4th or 5th. So that in itself doesn't necessarily bring new people to the medium. The medium has never really been explained to the mainstream public. Think about how late Google has come to it. Google has come very late to podcasting. They only now, in the past year, have come out with a native client. I know it probably has something to do with the fact that it has pod in the name. I don't know, but they're going to get there. But of those, the two levers that we can pull are, number one, to bring more people into the space by explaining it, And that requires the folks in this room pooling together and doing that. That's not been done in any kind of mainstream fashion, to explain to people what a podcast is and that you already have the thing in your pocket that can listen to it, right? The other lever that we can pull here is that spoken word to music lever. And that's going to take some work. That's going to take an investment also from everybody in this room into spoken word content in a way that really hasn't been done before. Spoken word content can be expensive to produce. Certainly that's why there aren't as many news stations as there are music stations, right? It can be quite expensive to put on a full-on news station or a news talk station, especially if you're not syndicating things. But that's what is required. But I know that that future is there. I know it's there because there's so much content that could be created for podcasts that is not being created. And I go back to that public radio having the muscle memory to do it. Look at the top podcasts on the iTunes Music Store. Look how many of them are from public media sources. Compare that list, the tenor, the quality, and the tone of those shows with the top-rated television shows. That's a completely different list. Those lists look nothing alike, right? One list is full of things like TED Talks and This American Life and Serial, and the other is full of Law and Order SUV, Law and Order CSI, all this crap TV, right? But there's this great potential for crap TV and podcasting. There's this great potential for mainstream content. But again, that requires the co-opetition of everybody in this room to invest in the space and not just to invest in your podcast. So I believe podcasting has a bright future. I believe it is going to continue to grow over the next 10 years. I believe we'll continue to call it podcasting, even though it's kind of a goofy name. We at least know what it is. But we are going to have to band together a little bit and invest in the medium as much as we invest in our own shows. Because 10 years from now, the question we don't want to ask is podcasting VHS or beta? I hope it's neither, because neither are around anymore, right? Formats die. But an investment in spoken word content, an investment in measuring the space, an investment in a shared way to look at downloads, an investment in a shared audience metric, investment in growing that speech share of ear, that's going to pay off. I'm convinced of that. But only if we all work together. Show us on the other side of the pond an example, because we're not quite there yet. But I think you can do it. Thank you very much.
This is Next Radio 2016 with Broadcast Bionics. Innovative solutions for creative people.